Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flight helmet one more time as she walked toward the Ah-64 Apache attack helicopter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following her every step. Some looks carried curiosity, others skepticism, and a few held outright hostility. "You sure you can handle that bird, Mitchell?" called out Major Thompson from across the tarmac. His voice carried just loud enough for the other pilots to hear. "That's not a training chopper anymore." Sarah didn't break stride or turn around. She'd heard variations of that question hundreds of times over the past 2 years. Ever since the military had opened attack helicopter positions to women, she'd faced the same doubts, the same challenges, and the same need to prove herself over and over again. The Apache stood before her like a mechanical predator, its angular frame bristling with weapon systems. Hellfire missiles hung from its stub wings, and the 30 chain gun pointed forward like a deadly finger. This wasn't just any aircraft. It was one of the most sophisticated attack helicopters in the world, designed for one purpose: destroying enemy targets with surgical precision. Her co-pilot and gunner, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, was already running through pre-flight checks. He'd been assigned to fly with her 3 months ago, and unlike many of the other crew members, he'd never questioned her abilities. Rodriguez had seen her scores from flight school, watched her handle emergency simulations, and witnessed her steady hand during training exercises. "Systems looking good up here, Captain," Rodriguez reported through the intercom as Sarah climbed into the pilot's seat. "Weather's clear, and we've got a green light for today's patrol mission." The mission briefing had been straightforward: patrol the border region, provide overwatch for ground units, and be ready to respond to any emergency calls. It was routine work, but Sarah knew that even routine missions could turn deadly in seconds. The region had seen increased insurgent activity lately, with enemy forces becoming bolder in their attacks on coalition positions. As Sarah went through her own pre-flight checklist, her mind wandered back to the conversation she'd overheard in the briefing room earlier that morning. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, had been discussing pilot assignments with his staff. "I still think we're making a mistake putting women in attack helicopters," one of the senior officers had said. "When things get hot, when lives are on the line, we need pilots who can handle the pressure. Combat aviation isn't like flying transport missions." Sarah had kept her head down, continuing to review her mission notes, but every word had hit like a physical blow. 2 years of perfect scores, flawless training exercises, and exemplary performance evaluations seemed to count for nothing in the face of old prejudices. The Apache's twin engines spooled up with a distinctive whine, and Sarah felt the familiar vibration of the rotors beginning to turn. This was the moment she loved most, when the machine came alive under her control, when all the skepticism and doubt faded away, leaving only the pure connection between pilot and aircraft. "Tower, this is Apache 27, requesting clearance for departure," Sarah spoke into her radio. "Apache 27, you are cleared for departure. Fly safe out there." The helicopter lifted off smoothly, and Sarah felt the weight of the aircraft settle into her hands. Flying an Apache was like conducting a deadly orchestra. Every control input had to be precise, every movement calculated. The helicopter responded to her touch like an extension of her own body, climbing steadily into the clear morning sky. From her position in the rear seat, Rodriguez monitored the weapon systems and sensors. "All systems green, Captain. We're showing friendly units at grid coordinates 247891. Ground units report all quiet in their sectors." Sarah banked the Apache toward their patrol area, the landscape spreading out below them like a detailed map. The terrain was a mixture of desert and rocky hills, with scattered villages and military outposts marking the human presence in this remote region. It looked peaceful from the air, but Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving. During her training, instructors had emphasized that attack helicopter pilots needed to think differently from other aviators. They weren't just flying aircraft. They were operating weapon systems that could change the outcome of ground battles. The decisions they made, the targets they engaged, the support they provided could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between soldiers going home alive or not going home at all. "Rodriguez, what's your read on the terrain below?" Sarah asked, wanting to keep her gunner engaged and alert. "Good fields of fire from our current altitude, Captain. I've got clear sight lines to all the known trouble spots. If anything moves down there that shouldn't be moving, we'll see it." Rodriguez had been flying combat missions for 4 years before being assigned to work with Sarah. His experience and calm demeanor had made their partnership effective from the start. While other crew members had needed time to adjust to working with a female pilot, Rodriguez had simply focused on doing his job professionally. The radio crackled with routine communications from other aircraft and ground units. Sarah monitored the chatter while maintaining their patrol pattern, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. Attack helicopter pilots developed an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, a sixth sense that could detect threats before they became visible. Apache 27, this is ground control. We've got reports of possible insurgent activity in Sector 4. Recommend you swing by and take a look. Copy, ground control, adjusting course to Sector 4. Sarah banked the Apache toward the new heading, her mind automatically calculating fuel consumption, flight time, and tactical considerations. Sector 4 was known for insurgent activity, a series of caves and rocky outcroppings that provided perfect hiding spots for enemy forces. As they approached the area, Rodriguez began scanning with the helicopter's advanced sensor systems. I'm not seeing any movement on thermal, Captain, but there are plenty of places to hide down there. Keep watching. Sometimes they wait until we pass before making their move. The morning continued with routine patrols and standard communications checks. Sarah found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of combat aviation, periods of alert boredom punctuated by moments of intense focus. It was exactly the kind of flying that critics claimed women couldn't handle, the sustained attention and quick decision-making that supposedly required male instincts and reactions. Around midday, they received orders to refuel and prepare for an afternoon mission. As Sarah brought the Apache in for landing, she noticed a group of ground personnel watching from the operations building. Among them stood Major Thompson and several other pilots, their expressions unreadable. After shutting down the engines, Sarah climbed out of the cockpit and began the post-flight inspection. This was standard procedure for all pilots, but she knew her work was being watched more closely than most. Every action was analyzed, every decision questioned, every mistake magnified. How'd she handle today, Rodriguez? Major Thompson asked as the gunner emerged from the aircraft. Like always, sir, professional, competent, by the book. Captain Mitchell knows her business. Sarah heard the exchange but didn't look up from her inspection checklist. She'd learned that the best response to skepticism was consistent performance. Words wouldn't change minds, but flawless execution might eventually wear down resistance. The afternoon briefing brought news of increased insurgent activity throughout the region. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were planning something significant, possibly a coordinated attack on coalition positions. All aircraft crews were placed on heightened alert status. We might see some action today, people, Colonel Harrison addressed the assembled pilots. Stay sharp, stay professional, and remember your training. Lives depend on your performance out there. As the briefing concluded, Sarah noticed several of the male pilots clustering around Major Thompson. Their conversation was too quiet to overhear, but their occasional glances in her direction suggested she was the topic of discussion. Lieutenant Rodriguez appeared beside her as she gathered her flight gear. Don't let them get to you, Captain. You're one of the best pilots on this base, and the smart ones know it. Thanks, Rodriguez, but I'm not here to win popularity contests. I'm here to do my job. Yes, ma'am, and you do it better than most. The afternoon mission began like the morning patrol, routine communications, standard flight patterns, and careful observation of the terrain below. But as they reached the furthest point of their patrol route, the radio traffic began to change. Reports were coming in of enemy movement in multiple sectors, and ground units were requesting immediate air support. Apache 27, this is ground control. We've got multiple reports of insurgent activity. Stand by for tasking. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the familiar adrenaline of potential combat began to flow through her system. This was what all the training had been for, the moment when theoretical knowledge became life-and-death reality. Rodriguez, weapons systems check. I want everything ready if we get called into action. Already on it, Captain. All systems green, full load of ammunition and targeting systems online. We're ready for whatever they throw at us. The radio exploded with urgent communications as the situation on the ground began to deteriorate rapidly. Multiple units were reporting contact with enemy forces, and requests for air support were pouring in from across the operational area. Sarah listened to the chaos unfolding over the radio and felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Somewhere below, soldiers were fighting for their lives, depending on aircraft like hers to provide the firepower and support they needed to survive. The critics and skeptics suddenly seemed very far away, replaced by the immediate reality of combat operations. Apache 27, priority tasking. Proceed immediately to grid coordinates 314782. Friendly forces under heavy attack and requesting immediate close air support. Sarah's hands moved automatically to adjust their heading as her mind processed the tactical situation. The coordinates put them 20 minutes away from the action, assuming they pushed the Apache to maximum speed. 20 minutes that might be too long for the soldiers fighting on the ground. Rodriguez, plot the fastest route to those coordinates, and prep the weapons systems for immediate engagement when we arrive. Already working it, Captain. ETA 17 minutes if we push it hard. The Apache surged forward as Sarah increased power and adjusted the rotor pitch for maximum speed. Below them, the landscape rushed past in a blur of brown and tan, but her attention was focused entirely on the radio communications that would tell her what they were flying into. What none of them knew yet was that this emergency call was just the beginning. Hidden in the chaos of multiple small engagements was a larger enemy plan, one that would test every assumption about women in combat aviation and put Sarah's skills to the ultimate test. The real crisis was still building, and by the end of the day, 500 coalition soldiers would be trapped behind enemy lines with no hope of rescue except for the aircraft that could reach them. And Sarah Mitchell, the pilot that so many had doubted, would find herself at the center of the most important mission of her career. The Apache raced across the desert terrain at maximum speed, its twin engines screaming as Sarah pushed the aircraft to its limits. Through her headset, the radio chatter grew increasingly desperate as ground units reported being pinned down by heavy enemy fire. Apache 27, this is Bravo Company. We've got at least 40 insurgents with RPGs and heavy machine guns. They've got us surrounded in a compound, and we can't move without taking massive casualties. Sarah's jaw tightened as she processed the tactical situation. Bravo Company was a reconnaissance unit that had been conducting routine patrols when they stumbled into what appeared to be a major insurgent staging area. Now 15 soldiers were trapped with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. Rodriguez, what's our weapon load? Sarah asked, although she already knew the answer. 16 Hellfire missiles, 1,200 rounds of 30, and a full load of 2.75-inch rockets. Should be enough to give those guys some breathing room. As they approached the target area, Sarah could see smoke rising from several buildings and the distinctive muzzle flashes of automatic weapons fire. The enemy had positioned themselves expertly, using the compound's walls and structures to create overlapping fields of fire that kept the coalition soldiers pinned down. Bravo Company, Apache 27 inbound, marking your position with smoke, and I need you to identify enemy locations. Apache 27, enemy positions are north and east of our location. They've got heavy weapons in the 2-story building at your 2 o'clock and machine gun nests in the courtyard. Sarah banked the Apache into an attack run, her eyes tracking the target buildings while Rodriguez aligned the helicopter's sensors and weapon systems. This was the moment that separated attack helicopter pilots from every other aviator, the ability to deliver precise firepower in close proximity to friendly forces. I've got positive identification on the 2-story building, Rodriguez reported. Thermal shows multiple heat signatures, and I can see muzzle flashes from the windows. Cleared hot, take them out. The first Hellfire missile streaked from the Apache's wing mount, leaving a thin trail of smoke as it guided precisely to its target. The explosion shattered the upper floor of the building, silencing the heavy weapons that had been raking Bravo Company's position. But even as they eliminated the first threat, Sarah could see more enemy fighters moving to new positions. The insurgents had clearly planned this engagement carefully, with backup positions and alternate firing points already prepared. Bravo Company, you've got movement coming from the east. Recommend you prepare to move on my next gun run. Sarah brought the Apache around for another attack, this time using the 30 chain gun to eliminate individual targets. The cannon fire was devastatingly accurate, each burst precisely placed to destroy enemy positions while avoiding any risk to the trapped soldiers. Apache 27, this is ground control. Sitrep on Bravo Company rescue. Ground control, we've eliminated the immediate threats. Bravo Company is mobile and moving to extraction point. But even as Sarah reported their success, her radio crackled with new emergency calls. Across the operational area, multiple units were reporting contact with enemy forces. What had started as isolated incidents was clearly part of a coordinated insurgent offensive. All aircraft, this is ground control. We have reports of major enemy activity across all sectors. Multiple units requesting immediate air support. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to the reports flooding in over the radio. Charlie Company was under attack at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Delta Platoon had walked into an ambush and was calling for emergency evacuation. Echo Company's convoy had been hit by roadside bombs and was taking heavy casualties. Rodriguez, this isn't random. They've coordinated this whole thing. Agreed, Captain. Question is, what's their real objective? You don't launch simultaneous attacks just to harass patrols. Sarah's tactical instincts, honed by years of training and study, began to piece together the enemy's strategy. The multiple small attacks were designed to draw coalition forces away from their main bases, spreading them thin across the operational area. But that meant the insurgents had to have a primary target in mind. Ground Control Apache 27 requests strategic overview of all current engagements. Apache 27, stand by for intelligence update. As they waited for the briefing, Sarah guided the Apache toward their next assignment, providing support to Charlie Company at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. But her mind was working through the tactical puzzle, trying to understand what the enemy was really planning. The intelligence update came through as they approached FOB Phoenix, and Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. The pattern of attacks was designed to draw coalition forces away from Camp Liberty, the main logistics and command center for the entire region. Intelligence analysts believed the enemy was preparing for a major assault on the camp. Apache 27, proceed immediately to Camp Liberty. All available aircraft are being recalled to defend the base. Sarah banked hard toward their new heading, but she could see they were at least 30 minutes away. If the enemy had planned their timing correctly, they would hit Camp Liberty before significant air support could arrive. Ground Control, what's the status of ground forces at Camp Liberty? Apache 27, most of our quick reaction forces were deployed to respond to the other attacks. Camp Liberty has minimal defensive forces available. The full scope of the enemy's plan was becoming clear. By creating emergencies across the operational area, they had drawn away most of the coalition's mobile forces, leaving their main base vulnerable to attack. It was a sophisticated strategy that showed careful planning and intelligence gathering. As they raced toward Camp Liberty, the radio brought increasingly urgent reports. Enemy forces had been spotted moving in large numbers toward the base. Mortar rounds were beginning to fall inside the perimeter. The small remaining garrison was preparing for a major assault. All aircraft, Camp Liberty is under attack. Immediate assistance required. Sarah pushed the Apache harder, knowing that every second could make the difference between holding the base or losing it. Camp Liberty wasn't just a military installation. It was home to hundreds of support personnel, logistics specialists, and medical staff who weren't trained for frontline combat. When Camp Liberty finally came into view, Sarah could see the situation was worse than reported. Enemy forces had surrounded the base on 3 sides, and mortar rounds were exploding throughout the compound. Several buildings were already on fire, and she could see personnel running between structures seeking cover. Rodriguez, target assessment, what are we looking at? I count at least 200 enemy fighters in organized positions. They've got mortars, RPGs, and what looks like heavy machine guns. The base perimeter has been breached in 2 locations. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. With only 1 Apache and limited ammunition, they were facing an enemy force that outnumbered the remaining defenders by at least 3-1. But the alternative was abandoning Camp Liberty and everyone inside to their fate. Ground Control Apache 27 on station at Camp Liberty. beginning attack runs on enemy positions. Apache 27, be advised that several other aircraft are en route, but you're the only air support available for the next 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Sarah calculated quickly. With their current ammunition load, they could maintain effective fire for perhaps 10 minutes before needing to withdraw. That left a critical gap where the base would be without air support. She began her first attack run, focusing on the enemy mortar positions that posed the greatest threat to the base. Rodriguez guided Hellfire missiles with deadly precision, each explosion eliminating another source of indirect fire. But for every position they destroyed, more enemy fighters seemed to appear. "Captain, we've got movement from the north. Looks like another wave of attackers." Sarah banked the Apache to engage the new threat, but she could see their ammunition was depleting rapidly. They were facing the kind of sustained engagement that attack helicopters weren't designed to handle alone. They needed support, and they needed it fast. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission that made Sarah's blood run cold. All stations, this is Camp Liberty. We have a critical situation developing. Approximately 500 coalition personnel are trapped in the logistics compound. Enemy forces have overrun our outer perimeter, and the trapped personnel have no way to evacuate. Immediate assistance required. Sarah felt her heart sink as the full scope of the crisis became clear. This wasn't just an attack on a military base. It was a potential massacre. 500 soldiers, medics, logistics specialists, and support personnel were trapped with minimal weapons and no training for this kind of combat situation. Ground control, Apache 27. What's the status of other air support? Apache 27. All other aircraft are engaged in emergency missions or still en route. You're the only immediate air support available for Camp Liberty. Rodriguez's voice was tense as he reported their ammunition status. "Captain, we're down to 6 Hellfire missiles and about 400 rounds of 30. At this rate of engagement, we've got maybe 5 more minutes of effective firepower." Sarah looked down at the chaos unfolding below and made a decision that would define her entire career. 500 people were depending on her and Rodriguez to keep them alive until help arrived. The critics who had questioned whether women belonged in attack helicopters seemed petty and irrelevant now. Rodriguez, we're staying until the job is done. Conserve ammunition, make every shot count, and prepare for sustained operations. Roger that, Captain. We're with you all the way. What Sarah didn't know yet was that the other aircraft wouldn't be able to reach Camp Liberty for another 45 minutes. Equipment failures, fuel shortages, and the ongoing demands of multiple emergency missions meant that she and Rodriguez would have to hold the line alone against overwhelming odds. The battle for Camp Liberty was just beginning, and the fate of 500 trapped soldiers now rested in the hands of the female pilot that so many had said didn't belong in combat aviation. Sarah watched her ammunition counter drop with each engagement as she and Rodriguez fought to keep the overwhelming enemy force from overrunning the logistics compound. Below them, nearly 500 coalition personnel were trapped in buildings that offered minimal protection against the mortars and rockets raining down on their position. Apache 27, this is Liberty Base Command. Enemy forces have breached the eastern perimeter. They're moving toward the logistics compound in large numbers. Sarah banked the Apache hard to intercept the new threat, her mind calculating angles and ammunition expenditure with mechanical precision. She had 4 Hellfire missiles left and less than 200 rounds of 30 cannon ammunition. Against normal odds, that would be more than sufficient. Against what they were facing, it might last another 3 minutes. Rodriguez, priority targets are anything threatening the logistics compound. Everything else is secondary. Copy that, Captain. I've got eyes on at least 50 fighters moving through the eastern buildings. They're using cover effectively, staying in the shadows between structures. The Apache's thermal imaging system painted the enemy positions in stark relief against Sarah's display screen. The insurgents had clearly planned this assault carefully, moving in coordinated teams with supporting fire positions already established. This wasn't a random attack. It was a sophisticated military operation designed to capture or kill the trapped personnel. Sarah lined up for another gun run, using the 30 cannon to eliminate a machine gun position that was raking the logistics building with sustained fire. The tungsten rounds tore through the enemy position with devastating effect. but she could see more fighters already moving to replace the casualties. Liberty Base Command, what's the ETA on additional air support? Sarah asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. Apache 27, earliest estimate is 35 minutes. All other aircraft are engaged or experiencing mechanical issues. You're still the only air support available. 35 minutes. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she processed that information. With their current ammunition levels, they could maintain effective fire for perhaps 5 more minutes. That left at least 30 minutes where the trapped personnel would have no air support at all. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate calls from the logistics compound. Any aircraft, this is Liberty Logistics. We've got wounded personnel who need immediate evacuation. Enemy forces are less than 100 meters from our position and closing fast. Sarah made a decision that went against every tactical manual she'd ever studied. Instead of conserving ammunition for maximum effectiveness, she was going to use everything they had to buy the trapped soldiers as much time as possible. Rodriguez, new plan. We're going to make them pay so heavily for every meter that they'll think twice about continuing the assault. Use everything we've got. Captain, that leaves us completely defenseless if we need to egress under fire. If we leave now, 500 people die. I can live with being defenseless. I can't live with abandoning them. Rodriguez was silent for a moment, then his voice came back steady and determined. Roger that, Captain. Let's make these shots count. Sarah brought the Apache into a low-level attack run that put them well within range of enemy small arms fire. She could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the aircraft, but her entire focus was on the targeting system and the enemy positions below. The remaining Hellfire missiles struck their targets with surgical precision, each explosion eliminating a key enemy position and buying precious time for the defenders. But even as they achieved these tactical victories, Sarah could see the larger strategic picture deteriorating rapidly. Enemy reinforcements continued to arrive from multiple directions, and the coalition defenders in the logistics compound were running low on ammunition. Several buildings were now on fire, and she could see wounded personnel being carried between structures by medics who were risking their lives with every rescue attempt. Captain, last Hellfire away. We're down to cannon rounds only. Sarah acknowledged Rodriguez's report and continued their attack pattern, using the 30 cannon with deadly efficiency. Each burst had to count now. There was no ammunition to waste on suppressive fire or area effects. Every round needed to eliminate a specific threat. The cannon ammunition counter showed less than 50 rounds remaining when Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission that changed everything. Apache 27, this is Colonel Harrison. I'm ordering you to withdraw immediately and refuel for follow-on missions. Sarah felt anger flash through her as she processed the order. Colonel Harrison was the base commander who had questioned whether women belonged in attack helicopters. Now he was ordering her to abandon 500 trapped soldiers when they needed her most. Colonel Harrison, negative on that order. We have 500 personnel in immediate danger. Cannot comply with withdrawal at this time. Captain Mitchell, that is a direct order. You will withdraw immediately. That's final. Sarah made a decision that could end her military career. She reached down and switched off her radio, cutting all communication with headquarters. Beside her, Rodriguez watched the action with concern. Captain, You didn't see anything, Rodriguez. Radio malfunction. We'll get it fixed when we land. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Roger that, Captain. Radio malfunction. How long before we get communications back? However long it takes to save those people. With their radio officially malfunctioning, Sarah and Rodriguez continued their desperate holding action. The 30 cannon ammunition was nearly depleted, but they kept making attack runs, using the psychological effect of the Apache's presence to keep enemy forces from advancing. From her pilot's seat, Sarah could see the tactical situation with painful clarity. The enemy had superior numbers and firepower. The trapped coalition personnel were running out of ammunition and medical supplies. Without immediate reinforcement, the logistics compound would be overrun within the next 20 minutes. But Sarah had noticed something during their sustained engagement that gave her an idea. The enemy forces were well-trained and well-equipped, but they were also cautious. Every time the Apache appeared overhead, They took cover and waited for it to pass before advancing. They feared the helicopter's firepower more than they should have, given their overwhelming numerical advantage. Rodriguez's new plan. We're going to make them think we have unlimited ammunition. How do we do that with no ammunition? We don't need ammunition to make noise and look threatening. We make attack runs without firing, use the rotor wash to kick up dust and debris, and keep them guessing about our capabilities. It was a desperate gambit, but Sarah could see it working. The enemy fighters continued to take cover every time the Apache approached, even when no weapons were fired. Their fear of the attack helicopter was buying precious time for the defenders. For 20 agonizing minutes, Sarah and Rodriguez maintained their deception. They flew aggressive attack patterns, used their sensors to spot enemy movements, and called in targeting information to the defenders in the logistics compound. The trapped personnel used this intelligence to position their limited forces more effectively and make their ammunition last longer. Finally, Sarah's headset crackled with the most welcome sound she'd heard all day. Apache 27, this is Apache 34. We've got eyes on your position and are inbound with full weapons load. Sarah looked up to see 2 Apache helicopters approaching from the west, followed by a pair of A-10 Warthogs that could provide sustained ground support. Relief flooded through her as she realized that help had finally arrived. Apache 34, Apache 27. Be advised we have 500 friendly personnel trapped in the logistics compound. Enemy forces surround the position in significant numbers. Copy that, Apache 27. We're taking over the engagement. Recommend you withdraw for refuel and rearm. But as Sarah prepared to hand over the mission to the fresh aircraft, her radio crackled with another emergency transmission. All aircraft, this is Forward Operating Base Phoenix. We have a critical situation developing. Large enemy force moving toward our position, and we've got civilians trapped in the medical facility. Request immediate air support. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the crisis was far from over. Even with reinforcements arriving at Camp Liberty, there were new emergencies developing across the operational area. The enemy's coordinated offensive was continuing, and coalition forces were still stretched to their breaking point. Apache 34, can you handle the situation at Camp Liberty with your current assets? Affirmative, Apache 27. We've got sufficient firepower to deal with the threats here. Sarah made another decision that would define her legacy. Instead of withdrawing for refuel and rest as any sensible pilot would do, she turned her Apache toward the new crisis. Rodriguez, what's our fuel status? We've got about 45 minutes of flight time remaining, Captain. No ammunition, but we can still provide reconnaissance and coordination support. Then that's what we'll do. Phoenix Base has civilians in danger and we're the closest asset. As Sarah guided the Apache toward Forward Operating Base Phoenix, she had no way of knowing that this new crisis would prove even more challenging than the battle they'd just fought. The enemy had prepared multiple surprises for any coalition forces that responded to their attacks, and Sarah was flying directly into the most dangerous situation of her career. Behind them, the battle for Camp Liberty continued as the fresh Apache crews engaged the enemy forces surrounding the logistics compound. But ahead of them, an even more complex tactical situation was developing, one that would test every skill Sarah had learned and push her far beyond the limits of normal combat aviation. The Apache raced through the desert air toward Forward Operating Base Phoenix, its fuel gauges dropping steadily as Sarah pushed the aircraft to maximum speed. Through her headset, she could hear the increasingly frantic radio calls from the base describing a situation that seemed to grow worse with each transmission. Any aircraft, this is Phoenix Base Command. We have approximately 200 civilians trapped in our medical facility. Heavy enemy fire prevents evacuation, and we've got wounded personnel who will die without immediate medical attention. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. The medical facility at Phoenix Base served not only coalition forces, but also local civilians who had been caught in the crossfire of the larger battle. Many were women and children who had sought shelter at the base when fighting broke out in their villages. Rodriguez, what's our tactical picture looking like? Not good, Captain. Phoenix Base is reporting enemy forces approaching from 3 directions with heavy weapons. Our friendly forces at the base are down to about 50 effective fighters, and they're low on ammunition. As Phoenix Base came into view, Sarah could see the situation was even worse than described. The enemy had positioned themselves expertly around the base perimeter, using natural terrain features to create overlapping fields of fire that kept the defenders pinned down. Smoke was rising from several buildings, and she could see muzzle flashes from multiple enemy positions. Phoenix Base Command, Apache 27 on station. We're showing low fuel and no ammunition, but we can provide reconnaissance and coordination support. Apache 27, any support is welcome. We've got enemy mortars set up in the hills to our north and sniper teams in the village to the east. Medical facility is taking direct fire, and we can't move the civilians to a safer location. Sarah studied the tactical situation with growing concern. The enemy had clearly learned from their earlier engagements and adapted their tactics accordingly. Instead of massing for direct assault, they were using precision fire and psychological pressure to slowly wear down the defenders' capability and morale. Rodriguez, thermal scan of the northern hills. I want to locate those mortar positions. Working on it, Captain. I'm showing multiple heat signatures in the rocky outcroppings about 2,000 meters north of the base. Looks like at least 4 mortar tubes plus security teams. Sarah flew a careful reconnaissance pattern, staying high enough to avoid most small arms fire while gathering intelligence on enemy positions. What she saw made her realize that this situation was even more complex than the battle at Camp Liberty. The enemy had established a sophisticated siege operation around Phoenix Base. Instead of trying to overrun the position with massed assault, they were methodically destroying the base's defensive capabilities while preventing any evacuation of personnel. It was a strategy designed to maximize casualties and create a humanitarian crisis that would damage coalition morale. Phoenix Base Command, Apache 27. Enemy forces are better organized and equipped than previous engagements. This appears to be a deliberate siege operation, not a standard assault. Copy that, Apache 27. Can you provide targeting data for our mortars? We need to take out those enemy positions before they destroy the medical facility. Sarah began the dangerous work of close reconnaissance, flying low enough to pinpoint exact enemy locations while avoiding the increasing volume of anti-aircraft fire. The enemy had clearly prepared for helicopter operations, positioning multiple teams with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. Rodriguez, mark target reference points for all enemy positions. We'll coordinate indirect fire from the base mortars. Roger that, Captain. I'm showing enemy mortars at grid 457892, sniper teams in the village at 458194, and heavy weapons positions on the ridgeline at 457798. Sarah relayed the targeting information to Phoenix Base, and within minutes the coalition mortars began landing accurate fire on the enemy positions. But even as they achieved these tactical successes, she could see that the overall situation remained critical. The medical facility was still taking direct fire, and several of the wounded civilians inside were in desperate need of evacuation to better medical facilities. The base's medical staff was overwhelmed, working under impossible conditions to save lives while enemy rounds continued to impact their building. Apache 27, this is Phoenix Medical. We've got critical casualties who need immediate evacuation. Without urgent surgery, we're going to lose at least 6 people in the next hour. Sarah felt her heart clench as she processed this information. Medical evacuation under fire was one of the most dangerous operations in military aviation, requiring precise coordination and significant risk to both aircrew and patients. But with no ammunition and limited fuel, her Apache couldn't provide the protective fire normally required for such missions. Phoenix Medical, what's the closest safe landing zone for evacuation aircraft? Apache 27, the only viable landing zone is the main helipad inside the base perimeter, but it's currently under direct enemy observation and intermittent fire. Sarah studied the base layout, looking for alternatives that might reduce the risk to evacuation aircraft. The main helipad was indeed exposed to enemy fire from multiple directions, but it was the only area large enough and clear enough for medical helicopters to land safely. That's when Sarah noticed something that sparked an idea. The enemy fire was coming in predictable patterns, with each position firing in sequence rather than simultaneously. If she could disrupt that timing and create enough confusion, it might be possible to create a brief window for medical evacuation. Rodriguez, I've got a plan. It's dangerous, but it might work. I'm listening, Captain. We use our remaining fuel to create maximum distraction and confusion. Multiple attack runs from different directions, rotor wash to kick up dust and obscure enemy vision, and harassment tactics to keep them focused on us instead of the landing zone. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment as he considered the plan. Captain, that puts us at extreme risk with no ammunition for self-defense. If they get lucky with an RPG or heavy machine gun, we're not going home. Rodriguez, those civilians will die without evacuation. Sometimes you have to take the risk. Roger that, Captain. I'm with you. When do we start? Sarah coordinated with Phoenix Base Command to time their distraction with the arrival of medical evacuation helicopters. Two A-60 Blackhawks were en route and would arrive in 15 minutes, giving her just enough time to set up the deception operation. For the next 10 minutes, Sarah and Rodriguez flew the most aggressive and dangerous patterns of their careers. They made fake attack runs from multiple directions, used their rotor wash to create massive dust clouds that obscured enemy vision, and flew so close to enemy positions that small arms fire was cracking past their aircraft constantly. The psychological effect was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Enemy fighters began focusing entirely on the Apache, trying to shoot it down instead of maintaining their disciplined fire on the base. The coordinated enemy fire plan began to break down as individual units became fixated on the helicopter threat. Phoenix Base Command, medical helicopters are inbound. Prep your casualties for immediate evacuation. Roger that, Apache 2-7. Medical teams are standing by. Sarah watched the two Blackhawk medical helicopters approach the base at maximum speed, flying just above ground level to avoid enemy detection until the last possible moment. As they flared for landing on the exposed helipad, she began her final distraction sequence. The Apache dove toward the largest enemy position, creating the impression of an all-out attack run. Enemy fighters opened fire with everything they had, focusing entirely on the attacking helicopter. In the confusion and dust, the medical helicopters landed, loaded their critical patients, and lifted off before most enemy fighters realized what had happened. Medical evacuation successful, Apache 2-7. Outstanding work. But even as Sarah felt relief at the successful evacuation, her fuel warning indicators began flashing red. They had perhaps 10 minutes of flight time remaining, barely enough to reach a friendly base for emergency landing. Rodriguez, we need to head home. Fuel state is critical. Agreed, Captain. Phoenix Base should be able to hold their position now that the medical crisis is resolved. As Sarah turned the Apache toward their home base, her radio crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. All aircraft, priority emergency. Large enemy force has surrounded Outpost Delta with approximately 100 coalition personnel trapped inside. No air support available. Immediate assistance required. Sarah looked at her fuel gauges and calculated their remaining flight time. They had just enough fuel to reach Outpost Delta, but not enough to provide meaningful support and return to base safely. Landing at Delta would mean potentially being stranded in a combat zone with limited defensive capabilities. Rodriguez, what's your call? We can make it to Outpost Delta, but it's a one-way trip. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Captain, those soldiers are counting on us. Let's go get them. Sarah banked the Apache toward Outpost Delta, knowing she was making a decision that could cost both their lives. But the alternative was abandoning another group of coalition personnel to face overwhelming enemy forces alone. As they approached the final crisis of this longest day, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since the morning. She'd started the day fighting skepticism and prejudice about women in combat aviation. Now, she was risking everything to save soldiers who would never again question whether she belonged in that cockpit. But the battle for Outpost Delta would prove to be the most challenging mission of her career, testing every skill she'd learned and pushing both her and Rodriguez far beyond the normal limits of human endurance. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls as the Apache approached Outpost Delta, but her fuel gauges told a story that made her stomach tighten. They had perhaps 8 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the outpost, but not nearly enough to provide sustained support and return safely to base. Rodriguez, final systems check. If we're going down, I want to know exactly what we're working with. No ammunition remaining, fuel for 6 to 8 minutes depending on power settings, and all sensors still operational. We've got eyes and ears, but no teeth. Through the Apache's advanced thermal imaging system, Sarah could see the desperate situation unfolding at Outpost Delta. The small forward operating base was completely surrounded by enemy forces that had moved into position under cover of darkness. Nearly 100 coalition personnel were trapped inside buildings that offered minimal protection against the heavy weapons fire raining down on their position. Delta Base, Apache 27 on station. What's your current status? Apache 27, thank God you're here. We've been under siege for 3 hours. Enemy forces have us completely surrounded with at least 300 fighters. We're low on ammunition, have multiple wounded, and can't establish communications with higher headquarters. Sarah felt the weight of those words settle heavily on her shoulders. 100 coalition soldiers were depending on her and Rodriguez to somehow turn the tide against overwhelming odds, and they had no weapons left to fight with. Rodriguez, reconnaissance sweep. I need to understand their deployment pattern before we commit to anything. Roger that, Captain. Beginning thermal scan now. As Rodriguez worked the sensors, Sarah flew a careful pattern around the outpost perimeter, staying high enough to avoid most ground fire while gathering crucial intelligence. What she saw made her realize that this was the enemy's main objective all along. The multiple attacks throughout the day had been designed to draw coalition forces away from their primary target, Outpost Delta. The small base served as a critical communications relay and logistics hub for the entire region. Capturing it would effectively blind coalition forces and provide the enemy with intelligence about ongoing operations. Captain, I'm counting at least 250 enemy fighters in organized positions around the base perimeter. They've got mortars, heavy machine guns, and what looks like anti-aircraft systems. This isn't just an attack, it's a full-scale siege operation. Sarah processed the tactical information while calculating their rapidly diminishing options. With no ammunition and minimal fuel, conventional attack helicopter tactics were impossible. But she noticed something about the enemy deployment that suggested a different approach might work. Rodriguez, look at their positioning. They're focused entirely on the base perimeter, but they haven't established effective security for their own rear areas. You're right, Captain. They're so focused on the siege that they've created vulnerable flanks and supply lines. Sarah's tactical training kicked in as she developed a plan that was equal parts desperation and brilliance. Instead of trying to attack the enemy positions directly, she would use the Apache's psychological impact and remaining fuel to create maximum disruption behind enemy lines. Delta Base, Apache 27, we're going to try something unconventional. Prepare for coordinated breakout attempt on my signal. Apache 27, negative. We don't have enough ammunition for a sustained firefight, and the enemy has us completely pinned down. Delta Base, trust me on this. When I give the word, concentrate all your remaining firepower on the northern perimeter. I'll handle the rest. Sarah began the most audacious maneuver of her career, using the Apache's superior speed and maneuverability to strike at the enemy's weakest points. She flew directly through the enemy's rear area at maximum speed and minimum altitude, creating chaos and confusion among fighters who had assumed their flanks were secure. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Enemy units began reporting helicopter attacks from multiple directions, creating confusion about the true scope of coalition air support. Communications broke down as different units tried to coordinate responses to threats that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Rodriguez, use every sensor we have. I want targeting data for Delta Base's mortars and machine guns. Already on it, Captain. Relaying precise coordinates for enemy command posts and heavy weapons positions. For the next 5 minutes, Sarah and Rodriguez conducted the most intensive reconnaissance mission of their careers. They provided real-time intelligence that allowed the trapped soldiers at Delta Base to make their limited ammunition devastatingly effective. Every mortar round found its target. Every machine gun burst eliminated a specific threat. But their fuel situation was becoming critical. Warning indicators flashed red across Sarah's instrument panel as the engines began consuming the last reserves in their tanks. "Captain, we've got maybe 2 more minutes before we have to auto-rotate. Where do you want to put us down?" Sarah studied the terrain around Outpost Delta, looking for a landing zone that would give them the best chance of survival if they had to set down in hostile territory. The desert landscape offered few options, but she spotted a dry riverbed about 1 kilometer from the base that might work for an emergency landing. That's when her radio crackled with the transmission that changed everything. "Apache 27, this is rescue flight inbound with 3 Chinooks and full escort. ETA 5 minutes to your location." Sarah felt relief flood through her as she realized that massive reinforcements were finally arriving. 3 CH-47 Chinook transport helicopters meant they could evacuate all personnel from Delta Base, and the escort aircraft would provide the firepower needed to keep enemy forces suppressed during the operation. Rescue Flight, Apache 27. Be advised that enemy forces have anti-aircraft capabilities, and the landing zone at Delta Base is under direct fire. Roger that, Apache 27. We're coming in with Apache escort and A-10 close air support. Recommend you clear the area immediately due to fuel state. Sarah made the decision that defined her as a pilot and as a person. Instead of withdrawing to save herself and Rodriguez, she chose to use their remaining fuel to coordinate the rescue operation and ensure its success. Rescue Flight, negative on clearing the area, will provide final reconnaissance and landing zone coordination. Delta Base personnel will need precise guidance for safe evacuation. Apache 27, that's extremely dangerous with your fuel state. Recommend immediate withdrawal. Rescue Flight, those soldiers have been counting on us all day. We're not leaving until everyone is safe. For the next 3 minutes, Sarah orchestrated the most complex helicopter operation of her career. She coordinated the approach routes for 3 massive transport helicopters while providing real-time intelligence on enemy positions. She guided the escort aircraft to the highest priority targets and ensured that Delta Base personnel were prepared for rapid evacuation. The Chinook helicopters thundered over the desert landscape like mechanical thunder, their twin rotors creating massive dust clouds that obscured the landing zone from enemy observation. Under cover of devastating fire from the Apache escorts and A-10 attack aircraft, they landed at Delta Base and began loading personnel at maximum speed. Delta Base evacuation in progress, all personnel boarding transport aircraft. Sarah watched from above as the evacuation proceeded with military precision. Wounded personnel were loaded first, followed by essential equipment, and finally the remaining defenders. Within minutes, all 100 coalition soldiers were aboard the transport helicopters and lifting off to safety. Evacuation complete, all personnel accounted for. But even as Sarah felt the satisfaction of mission success, her fuel warning indicators were now showing critical levels. They had perhaps 60 seconds of flight time remaining before engine failure became inevitable. "Rodriguez, prep for emergency auto-rotation. We're going down in the desert." "Roger that, Captain. It's been an honor flying with you today." Sarah began the delicate process of auto-rotative landing, using the Apache's rotor momentum to control their descent as the engines finally ran out of fuel. She selected the flattest section of desert terrain she could find and prepared for what would likely be a hard landing. The Apache touched down heavily in a cloud of dust and sand, its landing gear absorbing the impact as Sarah fought to keep the aircraft upright. When the dust settled, she and Rodriguez found themselves sitting in an intact helicopter in the middle of hostile territory with no fuel and no ammunition. "Well, Rodriguez, we're alive. Now we just have to stay that way until pickup arrives." "No problem, Captain. After today, I figure we can handle just about anything." They didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, a search and rescue helicopter arrived to extract them from their improvised landing zone. As they lifted off, Sarah could see smoke rising from the abandoned outpost Delta and the scattered remains of the enemy force that had been devastated by the combined air assault. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to reflect on the events of the day. She'd started the morning facing skepticism about women in combat aviation. She'd spent the day proving that skill, determination, and courage had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. When they landed at their home base, Sarah was surprised to see a crowd of personnel waiting on the flight line. Pilots, ground crew members, and support staff had gathered to welcome back the crew that had spent more than 12 hours in continuous combat operations. Colonel Harrison approached as Sarah climbed out of the rescue helicopter, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she wondered if she was about to face disciplinary action for disobeying his direct order to withdraw from Camp Liberty. "Captain Mitchell," the colonel said formally, then his expression softened. "Outstanding work today. You and Lieutenant Rodriguez saved over 700 coalition personnel and proved that courage comes in all forms." Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for 2 years. Not the weight of responsibility or mission pressure, but the weight of constantly having to prove that she belonged in that cockpit. "Thank you, sir. Rodriguez and I were just doing our jobs." "No, Captain. What you did today went far beyond duty. You showed us what real leadership looks like under impossible circumstances." As Sarah walked toward the debriefing building, she overheard Major Thompson talking to a group of junior pilots. "I was wrong about women in attack helicopters," he said quietly. "Mitchell showed us all what this job is really about. It's not about who's flying the aircraft, it's about having the courage to do what's right when everything is on the line." Sarah smiled to herself as she continued toward debriefing. The skeptics would probably find new reasons to doubt women in combat aviation, but today had changed something fundamental. 700 coalition soldiers were alive because she and Rodriguez had refused to give up when the situation seemed hopeless. The critics had insisted that women weren't fit for attack helicopter duty, right up until 500 troops were trapped behind enemy lines and needed someone with the skill and determination to save them. Sarah Mitchell had proven that courage, competence, and character were the only qualifications that really mattered when lives hung in the balance. And in the years that followed, when young women entering military aviation faced their own skeptics and doubters, they would have Captain Sarah Mitchell's example to show them that belonging in that cockpit had nothing to do with what others believed, and everything to do with what they were willing to give when their country and their fellow soldiers needed them most.